For the next week, we're going to be talking about schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. And it probably goes without saying that 2 class periods are nowhere near enough time to understand all of the nuances of disorders as complex as these. But that's an issue we've been contending with throughout this semester. Despite this, we'll do the best that we can to establish some fundamental understandings. So in order to do that, we're going to break up the lectures into 4 parts. Parts 1 and 2, which are due for Monday, will cover symptoms of psychosis, and then the theorized causes of psychosis and the diagnostic criteria for 3 of the disorders that fall into this category. Parts 3 and 4, which covers the diagnostic criteria for schizoaffective disorder and delusional disorder, and then treatments for all disorders in this category, will be due for Wednesday. So, to begin, we have to define this word psychosis. In the dictionary, psychosis is defined as loss of contact with reality. Or another way to say this is believing things to be real when they're not. Now, this is actually a really challenging idea. It's really hard to picture what it might feel like to lose contact with reality if you haven't done so. Given the difficulty of imagining what this is like, the DSM has specified that psychosis can be thought of as being comprised of 2 types of symptoms: positive symptoms and negative symptoms. And this should sound really familiar because we talked about positive and negative symptoms when we were reviewing the diagnostic criteria for dissociative disorders. And it's the same idea here. So as a reminder, you can think of positive symptoms as symptoms that are added on or as exacerbations of typical behavior, and then negative symptoms as symptoms that are taken away or reductions in typical behavior. In terms of psychosis, positive symptoms include disturbances in a number of different areas, including thought, speech, sensation, and motor behavior, and negative symptoms include diminished emotional expression and avolition, which we'll define towards the end of the presentation. So let's start by talking about disturbances of thought. When we talk about disturbances of thought, we're actually talking about delusions. And delusions are defined as idiosyncratic beliefs or impressions that are firmly maintained despite being contradicted by what is generally accepted as reality or rational argument. Most commonly, delusions are symptoms of mental disorders, though it is possible to experience delusions due to substance abuse or other medical conditions. The DSM defines delusions as fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence, and further stipulates that delusions are not the same thing as a belief based on false or incomplete information. So, for example, until the mid-16th century, people believed in this geocentric organization of the universe, that the Earth was at the center of the solar system. We wouldn't call that belief a delusion because it was based on incomplete information, which didn't know any better at the time. We didn't have the evidence for our current heliocentric model. Now, if someone today believed in a geocentric organization, that would be different because we do have the evidence to challenge that perspective. However, that would be a pretty uncommon type of delusion. Other types are much more common. For example, according to the DSM-5, there are several different primary types of delusions: persecutory, referential, grandiose, erotomanic, nihilistic, and somatic. Persecutory delusions are false beliefs that you're going to be harmed or harassed. Referential delusions are beliefs that certain gestures, comments, or environmental cues are directed at you. So an example of this would be like if you think the television program is directed at you, made for your viewing. Grandiose delusions are beliefs that you have incredible wealth or exceptional abilities, or that you're famous when you're not. Erotomanic delusions are the false belief that another person is in love with you. Nihilistic delusions are the belief that a major catastrophe or disaster will occur. And finally, somatic delusions are the false belief that there's something wrong with your health. Now, somatic delusions can at times play a role in some of the somatic disorders we talked about before. But remember that in order for something to be considered a delusion, there essentially has to be evidence that the belief is not true. For many individuals with somatic symptom and related disorders, the issue is more so that they feel the symptoms are just not yet understood, that there is a cause, that they are real, but it's just not known yet. Now, the really crucial thing to know is that delusions are not always bizarre or impossible. And in fact, the DSM-5 has a particular specification for bizarre delusions, which they define as a belief that is clearly implausible, not understandable to same culture peers, and not derived from ordinary life experiences. So essentially, a delusion would be considered bizarre if it's impossible. If it's not impossible, it is still a delusion, but it's not bizarre. So an example of a bizarre delusion would be the belief that an outside force has removed your internal organs and replaced them with someone else's without leaving any wounds or scars. Though in a science fiction film this might be possible, it is clearly implausible, so we would call it bizarre. Another example of a bizarre delusion is if a man believes that he's pregnant. This is clearly not biologically possible, so we would characterize that delusion as bizarre. So that's disturbances of thought. Now let's talk about the positive symptom of disturbances of speech. Overall, there are two primary types of speech disturbances that are evidence of psychosis. Derailment, which is when the person shifts between clauses, and incoherence, which is when the person shifts within clauses. Another way to think about this is if the person's clauses, so if they're single ideas or sentences, if those make sense, but what doesn't make sense is how those clauses are strung together, we would call that derailment. However, if the individual clauses themselves, again, so if those single ideas or those sentences don't make sense, then we would call that incoherence. In addition, there are a number of other characteristics of speech that indicate that speech is disturbed. Word salad is kind of like incoherence, in that a confused or unintelligible mixture of seemingly random words are all thrown together, like a salad. An example would be something like, "You aren't sailing past honor for the liking of a room. These questions are birthday basements. To end the blue radish is the upside of luxury, and sparking a good lizard can only make tears fall in hindsight." That's from Boston Legal. I did not make that up. And we typically see this only in advanced or really severe schizophrenia. Another pattern of speech disturbances we sometimes see is when people construct clauses based on rhyming or other sound associations rather than meaning. And we call this clanging. So an example of clanging would be something like, "He went an entry in trying, tying, sighing, dying, ding-dong, dangles, dashing, dancing, dingling." People can also sometimes speak in what's called neologisms, which is just a fancy way of saying made-up language, or can exhibit echolalia, which is the meaningless repetition of what someone else says. So essentially parroting back someone else's language, but not in a meaningful way. So if I were to say to someone, "How are you feeling today?" the response of a person with echolalia might respond, "Today? Feeling today? How are you feeling today?" The next category of positive symptoms that are characteristic of psychosis are disturbances in sensation, or in other words, hallucinations. And we define hallucinations as an experience involving the apparent perception of something not present. Now, in order for a sensory experience to be defined as a hallucination, it has to be very vivid or clear, it has to feel the same as perceptions based in reality, and it also has to be involuntary. In addition, by defining a sensory experience, now, in order for a sensory experience to be defined as a hallucination, it has to be very vivid or clear, it has to feel the same as perceptions based in reality, and it also has to be involuntary. In addition, by definition, a sensory experience is only called a hallucination if the stimuli isn't present. If the stimuli is present, but just perceived incorrectly, we would call that an illusion, which isn't a characteristic symptom of psychosis because we experience illusions all the time. For example, you feel a tickle on your arm and presume it's a spider when in fact it's just a string from your shirt. That's an illusion. But feeling a tickle on your arm when nothing has caused that sensation, that is a hallucination. And according to the DSM-5, there are 6 main types of hallucinations. Auditory, which is hearing things that aren't there. Visual, which is seeing things that aren't there. Gustatory, tasting things that aren't there. Olfactory, smelling things that aren't there. Somatic, feeling things inside your body that aren't there. So like feeling like your insides are twisting up, that would be a somatic hallucination. And then tactile hallucinations are feelings outside of your body that aren't there. So feeling like there are bugs crawling on you would be an example of a tactile hallucination. And of these 6 types, auditory hallucinations are the most common. The last category of positive symptoms of psychosis are disturbances of motor behavior. In this category, it includes a whole range of motor issues that cause difficulties in performing daily living. So, echopraxia is the meaningless imitation of another person's movements. Catatonia is defined as immobility or rigidity in motor movements. Stereopathy is repetition of fixed patterns of movement, so stereotypical behavior. Psychomotor agitation would be excessive motor activity. Hyperactivity, which is similar to psychomotor agitation, but this is just sort of a restless or aggressive or destructive activity. We can also have outright aggression, so forceful, angry, or destructive speech or behavior. Akathisia is the restlessness marked by an urgent need for movement, so the sort of pressured movement. And ataxia is an irregularity or failure of muscle coordination. In addition to the positive symptoms, there are also these negative symptoms of psychosis. The first of these is diminished emotional expression. And this can take a number of different forms, but most often looks like reductions in expressions of emotions on the face, reductions in eye contact, lessened intonation of speech, so less variation in speech, so speaking in a monotone, and reductions in movements of the head, hand, and face that normally give an emotional emphasis to speech. So you could think about diminished emotional expression as someone who's very flat, both in expressions and tone and movement. Avolition, on the other hand, is defined as a decrease in motivated, self-initiated, purposeful activities. And again, there are a lot of different types of avolition, the most common of which are alogia, which is diminished speech output, anhedonia, which is decreased ability to experience pleasure, and asociality, which is obviously lack of interest in social interactions. And one of the things that's really important to note is that although the positive symptoms are And one of the things that's really important to note is that although the positive symptoms of psychosis are what come to mind when we think about psychosis or symptoms of psychotic disorders, in reality, the negative symptoms, which result in that decrease or loss of typical behaviors, are what cause more life disturbances. So we'll stop there for now with this video. In the next section, we'll talk about causes of psychosis and then start in on the diagnostic criteria.